I need a haircut. This is the worst timeline. Hey there, VC. I hope everyone is continuing to stay safe and healthy. I know there's been reports of some people in our community, coming down with COVID. And obviously, I want to send them my best thoughts and best wishes for a quick and healthy recovery. Quite clearly, since my last update, things have gotten exponentially worse. When I say this is the worst timeline, this isn't necessarily a channel for me to talk about my opinions of the world. This is a channel for me to talk about music. But when something is happening all around us, sometimes it's important to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is myself as an American, has a lot to be worried about right now. I was recently watching another YouTuber who, kind of postulated the idea that this is the worst timeline. People are dying. Lots of people are dying in pretty extreme numbers. We've surpassed the amount of Americans killed in the Vietnam War at this point. Yet we seem to be unable to come together as a country to really take care of this, to really commit ourselves to a unified and collective response in the way that some other countries have. And it kind of adds to the sinking feeling that I've been experiencing. I think it might say something about the character of our society when we have a catastrophic humanitarian crisis and can't seem to pull our shit together. We're not doing enough for various reasons that I'm sure everyone's going to argue about in the comments, but we're not really doing our part. And people are getting hurt and dying because of it, and yet people are still complaining that we're doing too much. Like, this is the timeline that I don't understand. I don't understand how we can bungle our response and yet still complain about the inconveniences of the response, of the ineffective response. Needless to say, this has left me in a position of more or less disappointment in the world around me. And what better way to work through these feelings than the cathartic release we get from art and from music. Music that explores the darkest, deepest, most emotionally vulnerable places can have a real positive effect when we listen to it, when we explore it, when we open ourselves up to it. For me, music has always been a cathartic release. That's why so much of the music I listen to is so angst-ridden, because I think it's a very healthy way to kind of deal with less than pleasant thoughts. It's a healthy outlet for those things. Music can move us in ways that simple words and thinking can't. With all that being said, I pulled out some records, because I'm not buying new records right now for obvious reasons. So I pulled out some records that I think express some of these sentiments and can help myself and maybe others cope with some of the things we're feeling right now. So, with all that being said, here are some of the bleakest, most depressing records I could pull out of my collection. I'll start with classical. Here's an excellent Decca recording of Schumann's A minor piano concerto and also the woodland scenes. This is with Wilhelm Bauhaus and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Günter Wahn. This is a wide band UK pressed London blueback. You know, Schumann is an interesting romantic composer because, yes, Romanticism in the early 19th century was about expressing emotion, exploring the individual and exploring interpersonal thoughts in a way that hadn't really necessarily been tackled in that way in music yet, at least in Western Europe. And I think Schumann has the most interesting take on that. Schumann as a person exhibited what I think we would now describe today is clinical depression, and he dealt with it his entire life. He also probably had what we would consider today to be bipolar disorder. I'm not a psychologist, but it seems the literature suggests that. And because of that, his form of early Romanticism was always bittersweet. There was always a hint of something dark within even his most hopeful music. And that's something that we just don't get with like Schubert or Beethoven. You know, Beethoven had darkness, but it was always about struggle. It was always about attacking your darkness. And I think Schumann is a lot more vulnerable in some respects and a lot more open to the possibility that he could be defeated by that darkness. So that's why I included some Schumann. The other classical record I pulled out is, this is some bad glare. The other classical record I pulled out is Berg and Shostakovich quartets, but I mainly pulled this out for the Shostakovich. This is a Decca wideband recording of these two quartets by the Weller Quartet, which Shostakovich actually worked with at some points in his life. I think of all of Shostakovich's output, the late string quartets, the last, couple string quartets he did, were his most intimate and his most depressing. So that's why I pulled this one out. But, Shostakovich was always more adventurous in his chamber music than he was in his symphonies, because his symphonies were heard by more people and especially more Soviet party officials. So he was a little more conservative, I think, in his symphonic writing, and he always went a little bit more for big, grandiose, bombastic things in his symphonies. And his chamber music reveals a lot more of a vulnerable, intimate side. Especially some of his later quartets that were written after Stalin died. After Stalin died in Shostakovich's music, there's this big... you can sense that there's some hope and relief. And then I think towards the end of his life, he was less angry at his society and his government and more simply disappointed. And that there's some disappointment and kind of hopelessness you hear in his later string quartets. That, the great evil is no longer the thing he's struggling against. It's simply the disappointment with reality. And I think that that's kind of how I hear them. That's how I listen to his later work. It's this kind of collective sigh. Is this really what we've come to as a society? Other people may interpret Shostakovich's later work in different ways, but that's just how I hear it, and that's how I've come to kind of understand it. Moving to jazz, I pulled out a later work of Charles Mingus, and this is by ORG Records. This is Charles Mingus, Let My Children Hear Music. In many ways, Charles Mingus was a very large personality in jazz. I mean, he kind of had no qualms about saying what he wanted, not holding back any punches. And I think of all his music that is, his music is typically very strident and very politically minded. I think Let My Children Hear Music is him at his most intimate. It's not necessarily vulnerable, but it's very, it's his most beautiful music, I think. It's his most haunting music. And part of that has to do with the addition of like orchestral instruments that he arranged himself. So this is his most lush record. This is kind of his chance to make a sketches of Spain type of record. Speaking of Miles Davis, here we have one of my favorite Miles Davis records, In a Silent Way. I'm not gonna, I am no Miles Davis expert. I listen to and enjoy his music. This record kind of represents the end of his forays into traditional jazz, because the next record, I think the following record he made was Bitches Brew, and that kind of opened the door to a new type of jazz for him. So In a Silent Way is very much almost the closing of a chapter in some ways. That's how I view it. Jazz experts may have a different take on it. But this is kind of his most, of his later experimental style, later 60s experimental style, this is his most quiet and his most subtle. I have some good memories of this record. I think the first time I ever really listened to this record in its entirety was back when I lived in New York, and I think I put it on when I was taking like a 3 a.m. train ride back from like Bushwick or something to where I lived in Upper Manhattan. And it's kind of this thing where you're in this brightly lit environment of the New York City subway, but it's kind of deserted, you're kind of tired, and you feel like you're in a big city, but at the same time you feel very alone. And listening to that while just doing such a mundane thing as trying to get home at night, it was a really interesting way to experience the music. And I think in some ways, when a lot of us, when we listen to an album for the first time and it's attached to some type of event, whether it may be as mundane as taking the train or be a part of some milestone in our lives, we tend to associate that album with that time period. And this is definitely one of those things for me. The rest of what I pulled out is mostly rock records, just because I don't have a good reason. I don't think anyone can talk about depression better than The Cure. This is an original UK fiction pressing of The Cure's album Faith. To me, I think this is my favorite Cure album of their early darker goth period. Some would say Pornography is a better album. I think Pornography is definitely dark, but Pornography to me has a lot more energy. Whereas Faith, there's more space on this record. There's more time to kind of be alone with your own dark thoughts. I once heard someone describe this record as glacial, and I think that's a fitting description. And I pulled out 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral. This is a current pressing that came out like last year, I think. And it sounds pretty good. I think, this is 9 Inch Nails' most commercially successful album, and I think it's their best work. Trent Reznor really runs the gamut on here of emotions, and despite the fact that the song Hurt is probably more popular now for Johnny Cash's cover of it, I think the original on here by Trent Reznor is still a force to be reckoned with. It's just very different, and I think I connect more with it where I am in my life than the Johnny Cash rendition, because the Johnny Cash rendition is sung from the point of view of someone at a different point in their life. I included a couple classic emo albums in this. This is Minerals and Serenading. This is the reissue they did a couple years ago, which is they did a direct metal mastering for this reissue. This is their crowning achievement as a band, I think. It was actually released, I believe, after they broke up in the 90s. It's such a beautiful album, and it's probably my favorite 90s classic emo album. The Mob, Let the Tribe Increase. This album is pretty unique in that it's a early UK punk album. I think this came out around 1980. This is a reissue. I don't have an original of this. But it's darker and more introspective than a lot of its peers at the time. This album was being made when The Damned, I think, were still writing, poppy punk hits before they went full goth in the mid-'80s. This is a melancholy UK punk record at a time when punk was all about ferocity and speed and angst. And I think that makes it a really unique listen. This is kind of a proto-emo record. This is the only record by the band Embrace. This was the band of Ian MacKaye, who you may know from Minor Threat and Fugazi. This was the band he was in very briefly between Minor Threat and before he started Fugazi. And in many ways, this album has the energy of MacKaye's work in Minor Threat, but there's more interpersonal vulnerability, which is kind of the reoccurring theme in all these records I'm pulling out. It's the lyrics are a little more emotional, and this kind of is one of the couple records that came out of the DC scene that started the term emo. Now, when critics started labeling music like this record and Rites of Spring as emo, as a short for emotional hardcore, because these bands came out of the hardcore punk scene. These records were distinguished by the fact that they were an emotional take on hardcore punk. So that's where the term emo comes from. It stands for emotional hardcore punk. But emo kind of went and became its own thing later on in the 90s and yielded records like that Mineral record. This is a record by the band Envy. I think it came out in 2015. Yeah, 2015. The Japanese hardcore, post-hardcore, post-rock, post-metal band Envy. Envy are a band I've been a fan of for a long time. I really like all their records, and it was kind of tough to pull out a record of theirs to pick for this list, but I really like their 2015 release, Atheist Cornea, because it's kind of a return to their emotional and kind of angst-ridden roots, the records they were putting out in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it's the last record they did before they took kind of a hiatus, and their singer left for a while and then he came back. But this was the last record they did before any of that happened. And I saw them tour on this record in Montreal in, I think it was the fall of 2015, right when this came out. They were on tour with Death Heaven, and I saw them play at, I think it was Club Soda in Montreal, and that was a super great show, and they were absolutely incredible. It was the first time I ever got to see them. And I went over to the merch booth. I think I bought this at the merch booth, actually. I went over to the merch booth, and the guy working the merch booth was a member of the band Heaven in Her Arms, which is another band I think I might have talked about at some point on this channel, but it's another Japanese band that I'm a big fan of. They brought him on tour as their merch guy, I guess. I don't know what I really have to say about this record. This is Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. This is the Rhino Records reissue remaster of this record that sounds really good, I think. I've never heard an original, but I think this sounds quite nice. I'm not going to wax poetic about this record too much, other than that I think Ian Curtis was a tragic genius. And despite the fact that it's annoying how much the artwork for this band has been co-opted by the fashion industry, so it's kind of like a meme to like Joy Division now, I still like it. And I'm not, like a huge Joy Division aficionado. I just like listening to the records. I think they're quite moving. This is kind of a lesser-known album. This is Fear Before the March of Flames in their album, The Always Open Mouth. This was a record that I first discovered in my teens, my mid-teens, when I was kind of in my post-hardcore, I don't want to call it a phase because I still listen to post-hardcore, but post-hardcore was, at that time, the primary thing I listened to. And I had heard of this band because they often get paired up with bands like The Fall of Troy and Glassjaw, etc. So they are a post-hardcore band. But this is such a cool experimental record. There's so many wacky things going on, and there's some really interesting ambient moments on this record. So if you think all post-hardcore kind of sounds the same, you're really missing out by not giving this record a listen. Now for something completely different. I don't listen to a lot of hip-hop. It's not a genre of music that draws me in any particular way to it. It's not to say I don't like it. It's just that it's not something I connect with. all that much. However, every once in a while I'll hear a hip-hop album or a hip-hop song that I do like. About a year ago, I got turned on to group. I got turned on to this group called Ice Peak out of Russia. And this is their 2018 album that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but I'm sure if you look it up, you'll find it. Ice Peak are a hip-hop duo, I believe, out of Russia. They mostly speak Russian, although I think some of their songs are in English. And they've kind of become an underground phenomenon and have become very popular in the West recently because they are very much a politically antagonistic group towards their government in Russia. They've been vocally opposed to Putin, their government, the police. They're very much vocal about their support of LGBT rights and human rights and free speech in an increasingly authoritarian environment. And so I think they're a very interesting band because of that, but also because they really kind of have one of the better takes on this kind of like dark hip hop that has become popular in recent years. I think Ice Peak do it really, really well, and it's enjoyable to listen to even without the political context of the group. Speaking of political contexts, I'm going to pull out an album by a band I talk about on this channel way too much, and that is the 2011 album by the Japanese alternative metal gods Duran Gray. This is Dum Sparrow Sparrow. This album has continued to grow on me, I think, ever since it was released. There's an interesting backstory to this album. This is a giant deluxe. This is the original deluxe edition of the album that has the CD, a bonus DVD, and a double vinyl LP in it. It was kind of a pain to track this down, but it's one of my favorite Duran Gray albums, and I think it's the most interesting for this list because this album was in production when the Japanese earthquake and tsunami and nuclear crisis was happening. So a lot of this is definitely by far Duran Gray's darkest and heaviest album. This is the most closest thing to death metal they've ever made, although it's still not really death metal. It's still their own sound. But there's a lot of rage in this album, and a lot of that rage comes from the tsunami and earthquake in Japan was not simply a natural disaster. It was also a government and political crisis because of the nuclear reactor at Fukushima. And it wasn't just the nuclear reactor was damaged, there was misinformation coming from the government. The government was holding back data and information on exactly how dangerous the situation was, and all while this was happening, rescue workers were exposing themselves to lethal radiation in an attempt to prevent greater loss. But it's a very complicated event, and my summary of it doesn't know justice. There's a lot of pointed rage in this record directed at the government and wider Japanese society surrounding these very complex events and disasters that were happening in that year. And because of that, I think the rage on this record is very sharply focused, and it's very powerful to listen to and very cathartic, I think, in our current situation. Moving from something very heavy to something quite lush and beautiful, this is Junius's Reports from the Threshold of Death. This is a band I stumbled onto. Junius is kind of like a atmospheric, someone called them post-metal or just post-rock because they're not really heavy, but they do have kind of a big guitar-driven sound, so they could be classified as either post-rock or post-metal. This is a band I stumbled onto randomly, I think on YouTube, over a decade ago, and I just always kind of listened to this album. I think it's really lush and beautiful and very visual and scenic in a way that I think a lot of music in the post category can be, but especially in like the post-rock, post-metal category. And I think this is almost kind of a concept album in some ways about, the end of life, not necessarily about death, but about a retrospective on one's existence. And I think that's quite a beautiful thing to write art about. This is a pretty unknown album by the band Perfect Future. This is Old Wounds, Warmth in the Winter of 1914 to 1915. It's a concept record about soldiers in World War I and about the experiences and loss and tragedy that befalls them. And for that reason, it's incredibly beautiful. And this album is almost more like poetry and short story narrative than it even is music. But every time I put this on, I kind of connect to its narrative. This is a record that I don't think is at its face value a depressing record, but records and albums do not exist in a vacuum. And because of that, this is a very sad album for me. This is Phil Ochs, Tape from California. I think this is Phil Ochs' most melodic work. His most kind of... this is almost like his pet sounds to me. Phil Ochs was a 1960s beatnik protest singer. He was kind of like, very similar to Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger and people like that. But Phil Ochs' story is just far more tragic than those individuals. He struggled with depression his whole life, and a lot of his career trajectory and artistic trajectory kind of mirrors the turmoil and alienation going from the mid-'60s to the dawn of the '70s in our collective experience in the United States of America. Phil Ochs was very much a political rebel and leftist who started his career with a lot of hope for the future of the country and slowly became disillusioned not only with his country but also with his own political allies. I think he attended the 1968 Democratic Convention, and I think he very much became disillusioned and alienated from, the wider political movements in the United States because of those events and the direction he saw politics going. And that, coupled with his own insecurities about his voice, about his artistic strengths, and his clinical depression, caused him to eventually take his own life, I think in the mid-'70s, I want to say. So there's a tinge of bittersweet in all of Phil Ochs' works, even in the most strident and upbeat songs. But I'm particularly drawn to, I think what I think is his best song, and that is "The War is Over." And the message of "The War is Over" is the war is over if you want it to be. It was a appeal to the willpower of America during the Vietnam War, and I think there's a lot of comparison to be drawn in a song like "The War is Over if you want it" and our current situation. And I will let you draw your own inferences from that. This is a record by the 80s goth group, the Sisters of Mercy. It's their, I believe, first full-length album, First, Last, and Always. This is a MoFi Silver Label pressing of this album. The Silver Label, for those that don't know, just means, MoFi always does like full analog mastering for everything that has an analog tape, and that's how they do things, but they're not always able to get the best sources. Sometimes the original tapes are damaged or don't exist. So I think their thinking in the Silver Label was, if we don't have a good version of the master to do a reissue on this, we'll release it on our lower budget Silver Label. I'm pretty sure that's how MoFi does this. I don't think they use the Silver Label anymore. I haven't seen them release any new records on this label. So I think it was not a super popular thing. But the nice thing about the Silver Label is they used it to release kind of some lesser known, less popular albums. And the Sisters of Mercy record is just everything I love about 80s goth and dark wave music, in that it's so moody, and it kind of revels in its dark vampire-esque kind of aesthetic. Here's a record that always kind of makes me sad, or to me comes off as a sad record, and I don't know if there's any good reason for that, and it's Slynt's Spiderland. To me, there's just something about this record that's kind of a hidden gem in old post-hardcore music that expresses sadness to me, and I don't know why. This album was actually kind of a record by basically a band that was essentially prodigies. Slynt is a band, released this record when they were, I think, still teenagers, and it's kind of considered an unappreciated masterpiece by people who are into post-hardcore music. It's mostly instrumental, though. There's not really a lot of vocals on this thing. It's just really interesting and out there and creative instrumental post-hardcore. So I already talked about Mineral in how they were one of the quintessential 90s emo groups. Another band that I think is very, very important in the 90s in that style of music is the band Sunny Day Real Estate, and this is their third full-length LP, How It Feels to Be Something On. Their earlier two records, Diary and LP2, were very much on the more upbeat side of emo, or maybe not necessarily upbeat, but definitely kind of quicker and more aggressive. And I think this is the album where Sunny Day Real Estate really kind of slowed things down and explored a more gentle side of their sound. And to me, I think this is probably my favorite album by them. It's definitely more interesting and introspective. Speaking of interesting and introspective, the band Trophy Scars has always been, I think, an underappreciated band, and they're a personal favorite of mine. And they were originally they're still around. They were originally a post-hardcore band with kind of an emo-tinged, aggressive hardcore sound, and as they got a couple EPs and a full-length album deep, they started to get a little more experimental in their sound, and then they came out with this record, Bad Luck, which is a completely new sound for them. It still has a bit of the aggression of their post-hardcore earlier releases, but now there's a lot more influences from jazz and blues. There's just so many different sounds in this album that I think it's unfair to still consider it totally post-hardcore. And it would kind of signal the direction they were going in. This is a good album if you like things like Tom Waits, because the vocals on here are, I would say, very similar to the gravelly delivery of artists like Tom Waits. There's a lot of interesting, there's heavy moments, and then there's also really spacey psychedelic moments, like saxophone solos and really like big old blues chords. There's a 3-song concept arc towards the latter half of this album that's really interesting too. So for those that are looking for something a little bit different on this list, I think this might scratch that itch. I already picked out a Joy Division record, but another band that was very similar in their aesthetic and sound to Joy Division was the band Bauhaus, and this is their self-titled debut LP. What can I say? It's really dark post-punk that kind of anticipated. To me, this is the bridge between bands like Joy Division and later bands like Susie and the Banshees and Sisters of Mercy. This is kind of the goth bridge between post-punk and later goth bands. Now, going back to the more aggressive side of dark music, we have what is essentially a collected discography by the band Fascia. I could have just picked their full-length album, but instead I got this out. This is essentially all their works. They were a band that was only around for a couple years in the 90s. They were kind of considered the godfathers of Screamo. Now, not to say that there weren't Screamo bands before them, but, Fascia kind of established the sound, I think, set the precedent for what Screamo would be defined as. Very emotional, chaotic, and heartfelt lyrical delivery, very short, frantic songs, a lot of open minor chords, things like that. I think really no one has ever done that style in a more definitive way than Fascia. In talking about Phil Ochs, I think one parallel to the situation that describes the way I interact with Phil Ochs' music can also be used to describe the final album by David Bowie, and that is his Black Star album. I think this is the best album he's done since probably Scary Monsters. I remember listening to a track or two when it released and thinking this is actually quite good and I should really listen to more of David Bowie's later stuff. And then he passed away, and the record, I think for everyone, I can speak pretty universally in that we all kind of approached the record in a different way because of that. We saw this as his goodbye note, his swan song. And I think it's not a stretch to say he knew this would be his last work. I think he was totally aware of that, and that kind of makes itself expressed in the album. Not only is it a beautiful, haunting, and bittersweet album, but it's also mastered quite well, and I think will sound good on anyone's system. It's definitely a demo disc level album. That's not what makes it incredible, but it's part of it. The last record I picked out on this list is a record that I think has a lot of commentary that can apply to our current social situation, and that is Roger Waters' Is This the Life We Really Want? Now, there's not a lot I can say about Roger Waters' art that can't be said by just listening to his music. He's pretty open and transparent about his messaging, and I think there's a lot of relevance in this album to, this is not a old album. This album just came out in 2017, so it's still, the things it's talking about are current, but I think they're even more poignant today. Thanks for letting me do kind of a different video from my normal routine. I haven't really been buying records, and I don't know, I wanted to kind of, for this video, go back and revisit some works that move me in a difficult time. And I hope some of them, if you give them a listen, they will provide the same level of comfort and or catharsis for you. Isn't that the point of art, to be able to help us through situations, to be able to speak to us and let us work through our issues and our problems in a constructive way. I think that's really what I strive to do as a musician, and I think that's what musicians hope their work will be used for. I have no sage wisdom or advice for anyone as we work through this situation. It's not good. It's not looking hopeful. I don't want to read any more obituaries, and I know you probably don't either. So please be careful. Even as portions of our country are deciding to reopen, that doesn't mean the threat has gone away. In some places, the threat is actually increasing. So please be safe out there. I'm sending you all my best wishes, and let me know how you guys are doing down in the comments. I care about y'all. I will hopefully see you in the next video. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know when it's going to come out, but felt inspired to make this, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me babble once again. Cheers, VC.